All right, so we're just starting with some kind of raw materials. These are some small cedar branches that we're going to split up and use those to build our different traps. So starting with that.
Papa, this part takes too long.
Okay, so we've got that split up, and you'll notice that these are kind of long pieces. Most of these are going to get chopped down much shorter pieces. But if you have them long, it lets you make larger traps or design it to whatever your environment is. And one of the things you'll notice is the way that I split it was I didn't just quarter it up, but you'll notice that a lot of these are pretty square. And that's really nice for when you're doing like the figure four, because these flat edges, they're going to connect with each other, and the flatter, smoother that edge is, the easier it is for that piece to come off, so the more sensitive your trigger will be. So when you go to split it up, you can split it in quarters just like you classically would when splitting firewood, but if you cut it into chunks and then split your chunks apart so that it becomes square as you go, you can wind up with a lot more surface area to work with. And if you make them a little bit big like this, it's easy to whittle them down with your knife. So with that, we're going to start actually constructing the figure four. Okay, so your figure four is just that. You know, you're going to use 3 pieces that are going to form the 4, with one longer piece that's going to be your bait stick. And one of the things you want to do is you don't want to cut these pieces until you know what you're using for your weight, what's actually going to fall. So in this case, we have a pretty flat piece of wood. This is what we want to fall. Now, the height of this, you don't want it so high that when it triggers, that the prey has enough time to run out of the way. But you don't want it so low that the prey can't get in there. And then you have a really, really weird figure four. So, you know, anything slightly less than a 45 will work well. Okay. Now, the other part of this is you got to figure out your height for your main post here. In this case, you need it tall enough that your cross piece is actually going to be holding this up, can support it, and come down at a fairly reasonable angle, again, like a 4. And that's going to go bounce on a point there. And then your trigger stick, your bait stick, is going to come across. So if you can figure out sort of your lengths ahead of time, then it's a lot easier to cut these at the proper length the first time. So this is going to be pretty good in here. It'd be nice to get my 4 a little steeper, so I'll definitely have to shorten that up. But what I want to do is just kind of get an idea of how long I want each of these components. All right, so I just made a mark on them, and now I can start cutting them. So especially with something like this, it's pretty small, so I can just make some score marks on it, break it pretty easily. If it's a little thicker, one of the things you can do is you can make your score mark. That way you know where you need to cut, and then you can work small notches in. This will slowly remove material, go all the way around, and then you don't have to get through as much material to actually break it. All right. So we have our post. This one here will be our upright. This way with it.
I'm gonna zoom in on this shot.
What?
We'll do a longer bait stick for this one, I think. So what I'm going to do, just going to give it a nice pivot point. And that'll actually enable it to trip faster.
Can we get a shot of that?
Yeah, I don't want it knife thin, but I want it equal so it's nice and flat. Okay. And one of the really important things is you really want this line to be flat. Okay. If it's at an angle, you're gonna have problems. So if you're having trouble setting it, make sure that this is nice and flat and adjust it as needed in order to keep it. That way, when it actually balances on, your stick up here, you're going to be able to have it notched in there and it'll stay. So it's got good contact on it. So again, we're going to look at what we're aiming for here. And you'll notice what I'm trying to do is stick my main post here is nowhere under here, which means when it triggers, this can't fall on it. So if it's too close, falls against it, it's going to provide an area for the mouse to escape. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a small notch here. Okay. What that provides is a good contact point for your pivot here.
Okay.
Alright, and the last thing to do is on the other end of this, we're going to, again, we need a nice flat contact point. And we want that good edge on it. What that's going to allow us to do is our notch on this side, we'll be actually notching it right into this. And your notch should basically look like a 7 by the time you're done. Okay, so we have our 7. You'll notice that again, this line, you want it straight up and down. And the reason is because this is going to come in here and it's going to hold tension on there. So if this line slopes too far back, it's going to be really easy for this to pop out. Okay. You also want a real shallow approach here. Because again, if it's too steep, as it shifts, they can actually pin it in there. So now it's just a matter of matching these two up so they have a nice, good contact. So if this is too thick, it sits too high out of your notch here, and then it won't actually hold. So if we lay these out, this here is roughly our figure 4. So I'm going to make my mark here. And this mark is going to be very similar, except for what I want is a nice flat landing. because this is where that bait stick is going to rest on, and when weight is applied to the bait stick, it's going to shift it off this edge. And I think this is where a lot of people have the most problems. So again, a nice L-shaped cut. And if you cut too much out, you know, you have this bait stick as a measurement, and you can easily make another, or this upright post, you have it as a measurement, and it's easy to make another one. So with that, we're going to see where our bait stick is going to fall in that notch. So we got a little test pressure on it here, and we can see we're on our notch right here. So I'm just going to hold that there. I'm going to make a small mark on either side. That way I know roughly where this bait stick should land. Okay. Now you'll notice, if you look at it from this side, my bait stick's upright. This bait stick is canted this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim it to get it so that it's level like this. So we're a little closer here, but we have a little bit more to remove. The other thing we can do is we can lengthen this out. And it's okay to make this kind of a deeper lip for it, because you can adjust where it hits on that lip pretty easily. And the closer to the edge of that lip is, the more sensitive it'll be. Okay, so I got it about where I want it. Now what I want to do is figure out how long I need this to be. And so ideally, what I can do is I can get this bait stick nice and far underneath there. And the reason you want that is because the further under there, the harder it is for them to escape. So now what we're going to do is we have this nice flat perpendicular surface where it mates up with our upright. What we're going to do is we're going to create another 7. We're going to notch it so that that notch hangs up on our post. Okay. So we have a 7, which means this notch fits in together, and if I pull this back, it can't go anywhere. And that's part of that mechanism, because we'll see here that when this fits in on this pivot, and we put pressure down from the top, what it wants to do is pull our bait stick backwards, okay? And it can't do that. So you can see this here. So this is the whole mechanism set up, okay? This downward pressure is transferring to here. It's trying to pull this bait stick backwards. This bait stick is hung up on our upright, and it's also, you'll notice that this part here is hung up right there. So what happens is we put this under tension, like so. And we have our little bait here on the end, and an animal hits it, and it comes apart. So now that we have all of that set up, we're going to shave down the end of the bait stick. Okay, there's a couple different things you can do here. You can make it a point, and you can slide your bait over it. You could also split it and pinch your bait in there, which it doesn't really matter necessarily which way you use. But what's important is that your bait is on there strong enough that when a mouse or you know, bull or something comes and tries to tug on it, that tugging action is what actually makes the trap trigger. So, we have that all set up. Okay, so now we have all of our pieces assembled. Okay, so to set this up can be a little bit of a challenge. One of the things I recommend doing is either propping your piece up while you're working on it, or I'll show you the technique I prefer. But first, we're going to do our bait, and this is just for demonstrations, but use a berry, a bug, earthworm, something of that nature, a bit of root that you have to dig, and that usually will get a rodent to come out. So for demonstration purposes, bait's on the end of the stick. Now, we're going to take our upright, piece right here. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is you want the area underneath nice and flat, so that way, when it triggers, it has a flat surface to actually contact. And you'll see as this goes under pressure, you do kind of have to adjust it to make sure that everything is connected. One of the things that will happen is this will want to shift left and right. Okay, and so having a flat edge to your drop piece really helps that. All right, so we have our stick in there, we have our little bait, and that's it set up. So you have your rodent that comes along. Okay, so everything's set up now. You have your rodent that comes along and tugs on this bit of bait, and it comes right down. So if we were to watch that in slow motion, which I don't have a slow motion camera, so we can't, the mechanism that's occurring is, coming out close on this one. Do I come from the top? Oh, this is all untensioned. When the end of this bait stick gets moved, you see how it connects there? As it moves, it rolls off. Okay. And once it rolls off, that tension pulls the bait stick out, allowing your hinge to drop free. Okay, and that's the basic setup for it. And you know, that's what you got. Now, one thing to think about is your angle when you have this set up. I had it set up pretty low, and depending on what you're actually trying to trap, having your bait stick low on the ground or higher on the ground has different benefits. If it's low on the ground, smaller creatures can get to it easily. If it's a little higher up, it forces the creatures to have to reach up to grab that bait. And when they reach up, they actually put more weight on it. So they're more likely to be committed there. So if this is higher off the ground, so if you're looking at from the angle here, you know, this is close to the ground, the mouse can come in from the side and pull outward. And if they're doing that, they're closer to an escape route. If you have it higher up off the ground, they now have to reach up or jump up. So they're likely to apply more weight suddenly, but they're also off foot, which means that when this slams down, it's harder for them to hit the ground and run out before they get smashed. So something to keep in mind. Another technique you can do is when you have this set up, you can also place items on the side that makes it harder for the animal to escape outward. The problem with that is, depending on how you set it up, you run the risk of catching something underneath here, creating a gap in which, you know, the rodent can escape. But that's the figure 4. Okay, so we're going to do a couple variations on the Deadfall. This first one's really simple. This is basically the simplest version you can make out there. And all you're going to do is you're going to take a stick, a small stick like this, round. You're going to cut it in half here, and you're going to round those edges slightly. Okay, you don't want a lot of flat space. And one end you're going to stick into the ground. So in this case, we're going to pin it right here. So you want this one nice and sturdy. You're going to take your round end up, your other round end is going to go right here, and then at an angle, you're going to place it, okay? Now, once you've got it placed, you're going to take a small stick, and you're going to squish it between the two. And this can be kind of hard to set up, but you want it right between the two so that any movement of this stick causes this come undone. And those are just two kind of round edges on each other. So when they shift at all, it's easy for them to slide off each other. So in this case, you have your bait stick, pull, falls. Okay. Now this one can be, you can do a lot. If you go to, if you're, now one of the things you can run into is if you don't have your angle steep enough, when this comes down, it can land on your upright stick, and this stick's not going to fall out of the way. So that's why you need to make sure that you're out away from it, and you're going to use that backwards pressure, and that's why that upright stick that's stuck in the ground has to be stuck into the ground, okay, because it has to support all this pressure pushing backwards. And it can be very hard to set up your bait stick. So if you're in a really windy area or something like that, this isn't a great idea, but incredibly simple to do. It comes down. So that is an easy to do. You don't need anything special. You don't need any twine or anything. Now the next one we'll look at is the Paiute pitfall. And this one's very simple when you really kind of get used to using it. Basically what we did before. So you have your upright stick that's generally going to get stuck into the ground, okay? It has a point to it with a nice flat surface. You have this stick here, which has a notch in it so that it can't slide backwards, okay? Your weight's going to go on the end. Again, you're going to make sure that it's out of the direction of fall. You have your small line that comes to a stick that's got a flat side on it, okay? This stick gets wrapped around just like this. Your bait stick gets wedged between the two. Now this one is a pretty sensitive trigger, so it can be a little finicky to set up, but you're basically pinning the two together. Now in this case, you have your bait up here, and you can even sometimes pin your bait against it, and that's all it takes. So let's change the angle so you can see how this mechanism works. Okay, so here we have it starting to set up. You have the weight, and you can see the weight wants to come down, lift this end up. This right here is just a little bit of cordage, twine attached to the end, and you just have this small trigger switch. And when you do this, it doesn't need to be very long, but you want a short side and a long side. And what you're going to do is you're going to bring your cord around the front. You're going to take that short side and you're going to attach it to the back, and it's just going to rest there. Now this weight wants to pull this cord, and by doing so wants to flip this around.
There you go, perfect.
Now something to keep in mind is sometimes when you set this up, this cord might be underneath.
Okay.
Don't do it that way, because what happens is the weight of this pulls up and pins this in place, and then it can hold itself so it doesn't trigger. So what you want to do is make sure this cord is above that small side.
Let's get a shot of that too.
So it's above the small side. Now you have your small bait stick, and a lot of times if you put a little break in it so it's even more sensitive, it'll make it a more sensitive trigger. One end is going to go against the long side. The further out, the more leverage it has, so the smaller you can use. And the other side is just going to go up against your weight, and this is where your bait's going to be. So what'll happen is when a mouse or vole reaches up to touch this, it's going to dislodge the stick. You'll see it come down. So we'll do another angle. I'll show you what I mean by having a string underneath instead of over the top. Okay, so as you can see, we have the short end lodged against here, and all of this pressure is being transmitted to right here, and it wants to spin around. Okay, the problem is that if you get this underneath, that pressure is now twofold. It wants to pull it this way, but it also wants to pull it up. And if it pulls up and gets hung up, like I can put it right here, and that's holding everything. I don't even have a trigger switch, okay? But if you do it with this line over the top of it, reset that. If you do it over the top like this, it can't pull up against the stick as well. And then you can even adjust your stick up, down, kind of wherever you need it based on the length of your bait stick, okay? And again, really simple. We're just going to do a little bit of pressure. It takes next to nothing to do that, and it is incredibly sensitive. So your bait right up here, and again, this is an example where you have your bait off the ground. So this is kind of high for a mouse to get to. You know, they could jump to it, but they wouldn't necessarily do that. So instead, you can put your bait a little further down. But the point is that it takes next to nothing to do it. So let's look at this piece really quick too, though. So you'll notice on this one, oh, there it is. Okay, so on this one, you know, we have that same basic pivot point that we had on our figure 4. Down here, what I've done is, because this is a wide flat piece, in order to make it more sensitive, I narrowed the width and I created these little notches here. And what that does is when the weight is on here and that string comes down and around, it makes it harder for it to ride up. So that's going to stay there. Now, all it has to do is overcome a small bit of area to get around. Now, if you did it higher up on this, it has to overcome all of that extra resistance, so it is a less sensitive trigger. So if you're using a wider piece like I was, you know, you can round it down, and that'll really help you with setting it up. But again, that string over the top, and then changing the height of where this trigger is. I like it right in about the middle, and kind of getting that classic figure 4 shape to it, because that seems to be sort of the best of both worlds. But if you need it further down, put your notches further down, and that can lower your bait stick as well. Okay, so I mean, that's the figure 4 trap, right? It didn't take us too long to build. It's pretty simple, and now we just have to wait for, you know, a rodent to come along, pull on that bait stick, and we've got some calories. But there's a really important thing to also recognize, is that while we're doing this, we're hyper focused on getting these calories, right? But we're surrounded by calories right now. I mean, all of this in here is cat's ear, you know, an edible plant. The entire plant is edible. The roots are edible. They're easy to preserve, and it is a legitimate source of carbohydrates and simple sugars. So it's easy to get focused on building the cool, intricate stuff. But at the same time, you know, if this isn't something that, at the same time, it's easy to get tunnel vision and say, you know, this is what I need to survive right now, and to be blind to everything else around you. So think of this as a tool. This is like your Leatherman or your multi-tool, right? This is one tool in that multi-tool, but it's not the only tool. So make sure that, you know, when you go out there, that you've got more than one tool to use. It is fun though.
So, we're at the Buckham residence, and I've been teaching one of my better students how to create a trap. So here are his. You can see they're pretty amateur, you know, but he did a great job, and I'm going to show you how a real guy does it. So you got your little bait stick right here, your pivot point, got your load-bearing stick, and then little mouse comes by and boom! That's right. Took a bit more effort than I thought it would to push that down, so it has to be a heavy mouse. I'm going for big mice, big ones, swole mice.
What's that trap called?
It's called a figure 4.
Nicely done, sir.
Right. I thought I didn't know that.
Dinner time. Good enough flex.
Oh, God.